Okay. Didier, today is special day for us. You know that?
Yes.
Yes. This is commemoration for Atatürk and Youth and Sports Day. Is a very special day for our country. This is why I put our flag there.
Okay. I didn't get. It's a holiday, right? It's a special.
Yeah.
And what is the celebration?
This commemoration of Atatürk. You know who is Atatürk? This is our founder of our nation.
Okay.
And he dedicated today to youth and sports.
Sports.
That's a special day. It's the beginning of the everything.
Okay.
That's
so
the special day. And thank you very much. And this is one of my painting of Atatürk. It's from watercolor.
Wow, wonderful.
Okay.
That is amazing.
I'll try.
That is amazing.
I'll try. Okay.
You try and you succeed. You try and you succeed.
Also, it's difficult, huh? Everybody try to do that. It's difficult to draw him. It's very special for us.
Okay, but it looks really beautiful.
Thank you. If you like, we can go directly to the case.
Yeah.
Before interrupting with the connections, okay?
Okay. Quicker we are done, the safer it is.
Okay. I will switch to the case if you like. It's like that. I think it's clear, huh?
Yeah.
Perfect. I have also some pointer somewhere like that, or maybe like that. If you want to, I can enlarge like that.
Okay. If you want to look at detail, excellent.
I will have some questions also for you, huh?
Good. So maybe I can just start by greeting everyone and to say that we are really sorry that we couldn't proceed last week, that we had a disconnection problem. I personally assumed that this was a limitation in our network connection here in Switzerland that basically disconnected us so many times, and we had to give up because that was really not possible. So thank you for those who have been with us last week and who are back again tonight, and we really hope that tonight we can proceed with the whole program and complete our discussion.
Okay,
so welcome everyone from my
translate a little bit. Okay. Arkadaşlar tekrar hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Atatürk'ü anma ve gençlik ve spor bayramımız hepimize kutlu olsun. Thank you very much my dear. Coming here again for the third time. Thank you very much again. Didier tekrar geldi severek. Geçen sefer bayağı bir bağlantı kopmuştu, etmişti, yarıda kalmıştı. Bu posterior'da benim için sizlere biraz yardımcı olabilmek için, hepimizin çok hata yaptığı da bir bölüm olduğu için bu işin duayeninden, en iyilerinden, dünyanın en iyilerinden Didier. Ondan bir takım bilgiler alalım. Ben bir takım sorular sorayım. Yorumları kapattım. Lütfen sorularınızı bir yere not edin veya oradaki soru kutucuğuna koyun. Ben onları sormaya çalışacağım. Ben kendim de zaten sorular soracağım. Umarım sizin aklınızdakileri de sorarım. I shut the comment boxes, comments.
Oh.
Then afterwards we will take the questions.
Yeah.
If we can finish earlier, then we can continue with the questions. Okay?
Yeah,
then
sure.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So the idea tonight is to discuss some relevant points in regard to direct composite restorations. I think there are probably three elements that are interesting to discuss. The first one are the indications of direct techniques versus indirect. The second question might be just to do or to make a few comments on the use of bulk filling materials. You will see that for the treatment of this patient, I haven't used a bulk filling material, and I would like to make a few comments on this. And the third element will relate to the adhesive system. What I like personally to use for such cases. So in fact, I would like, or would you like to make some translation already, Engin, or can I just move forward?
Yeah, you can move. I don't want to disturb you too much. I will make a small summary in between, okay?
Okay, good. So you stop me, huh? Whenever you think it is time to make a little translation, you stop me.
Okay.
So what we see here on the screen, in the middle of the screen, are two old amalgams. Margins are infiltrated. The contact is not allowing the patient to floss properly. And we have also some wear facets. Patient anyway did not want, for both aesthetic and somehow medical reasons, to keep those amalgams. As you might know, there are more and more patients who, even in absence of any local problem, wish not to keep amalgams in their mouths. We know that the scientific rationale is maybe not very strong in regard to any potential contamination of the human body by mercury released from amalgams, but it is a trend, and I'm not trying to fight with patients if they don't feel comfortable having in mouth these old amalgams. I'm not going to fight to leave it in place. I think here anyway it doesn't make much sense to try to convince the patient to keep with amalgams. So the indication for me here is a perfect indication for direct restorations, because we have what we call medium for the first premolar, medium large for the second premolar cavities. So that is really, that fits within the indications for direct bonding. You might know or not, or you might share this opinion or not, but we do less and less inlays, whether it is with composites, whether it is with CAD/CAM, whether it is with indirect techniques using monolithic ceramics. Over the last couple of years, we found that direct composite works relatively well for this type of treatment. I have some literature showing that in such a situation, like restorations, you're not going to get any better term of adaptation. And so the extra cost for going through the indirect technique is not worthwhile for the patient. So we can begin. If you can.
Before that, I can translate.
Yes, sure. Sure,
okay.
Sure.
Arkadaşlar kısa şeyler yapacağım. Çok fazla vakit de almayayım. Didier'in kaçmasın, hem konsantrasyonu. İndikasyonlardan bahsettik. Demin gördüğünüz 2 tane amalgam restorasyonun tam da bir direkt restorasyon indikasyonu olduğunu, 4 numaranın bir orta boy bir restorasyon, diğerinin büyük boy bir restorasyon olduğunu, yavaş yavaş inleylerin daha az yapıldığını, daha çok direkt restorasyona doğru yönlendirildiğini, adhezif sistemlerimizin güçlülüğü sayesinde artık direkt restorasyonun daha önemli olduğunu, hastaların da zaten artık amalgam restorasyonları çok fazla istemediklerini, bu takım kenar bozuklukları ve iple temizlemelerin zor olduğu bölgelerde gayet uygun indikasyon olduğunu söyledi özetle. Okay, the next one.
When we take amalgams away for the reason that I mentioned before, if there is one step that presents a small risk in terms of contamination by mercury while we remove the amalgam. So that we usually take when first one is to work on the rubber dam, and the second one is to use a high volume suction system so that we can try to recuperate as much as we can the vapors of mercury that might be created by the removal of amalgam. So those are the two recommendations that we normally do when it comes to removing amalgams. So here you see that despite the fact the contact relatively tight, despite the fact the contact, the proximal contact is a little bit damaged, we were able to bring the rubber dam in between the teeth. Something that I don't know whether it is common or not in your practice. Here I'm not talking to Engin in particular, but to every person following this Instagram talk show, is that silicone rubber dams are much easier to penetrate, to move into tight contacts compared to a traditional latex rubber dam. So this specific one is called Isodam, and it's a rubber dam which is very easy to move in between the teeth and even tight contacts. Are you using a latex rubber dam and give yourself, or are you also using
common thing is
latex,
latex.
different rubber dams?
You can hear me?
Okay. So if it is anyway, technically it is the same. Yeah, sure. You can hear me? I can still hear you. I think we're gonna change the telephone,
okay,
to
why
be
not?
sure. To okay, we might switch.
Didier'in oralarda bir şanssızlık oluyor nedense. Hay Allah. Dur bakayım, bir başka telefonla deneyecek. Bu arada ben tercüme edeyim olayı. Bu değişik bir izodam diye biz kullanıyorduk eskiden, artık bizim piyasada var mı yok mu onu bana bir şey yaparsanız. Benim sesim var da Didier'in sesi sizde yok herhalde. O dondu kaldı. Değil mi? Didier orada yuvarlak. Ses var diyorsun da benim sesim herhalde var Enes. Neyse ben şeye devam etmeye çalışayım. İzodem kullanıyormuş. O lateks değil, silikon. Bir dakika. Bakalım şimdi alabilecek miyiz? Silikon rubber damle aralardan daha rahat geçerim diyor.
Okay. So
This is your next one?
yeah, the other telephone. So hopefully this one is going to work.
Okay.
Really sorry for that.
We are using mostly latex.
Latex.
I have one from Coltin, the purple one. I don't know if it's latex or the silicone. It's very easy also.
Yeah. Okay. This one that I was using is I really switched completely, also because the only time in my life that we were facing a medical emergency was with latex rubber dam for a patient who was not aware of her allergy to latex, and she made a quick edema, and that was a bit of a stressful moment. Well, we had everything to adrenaline and cortisone spray, but we went through a rather stressful experience. And from that moment, I started to use different kind of non-latex rubber dams until we found that one. But it was just a little remark, because it might be of interest. If someone has a patient who is allergic, this specific brand is probably a good one to try.
Okay.
It's the best that I found up to now. Okay?
Okay.
Good. So I think we can move to the next slide.
Okay, before go to the next, I will translate the
yes, sure.
amalgam thing. Amalgamı sökerken bir iki bilgi verdi aslında tabii faydalı. Birincisi tabii ki bir rubber dam izolasyonu. İkincisi de yüksek güçlü bir suction sistemi. Tabii oradaki bir takım şeylerin evapore olan dumanın duman demeyeyim de anladınız işte neyse o civa tanecikleri artıklarının solunmasını engellemek için güçlü bir suction ve de iyi bir rubber dam izolasyonu olması lazım amalgam sökerken. Benim eklemeye çalıştığım şey şu olabilir. Amalgamı böyle ince ince sökmek değil de kenarlarından böyle bir alev uçlu frezle girerek blok halinde çıkarırsak çok daha etkili bir temizlik yapmış oluruz diyeyim. Okay.
Good. So we can move to the next image. So we see now both cavities ready for adhesive procedures. And you see that the second cavity, the second premolar, MOD is a little bit larger than the first one, as we were expecting. We could discuss the need to cover the cusps, but in fact, and that was one of the arguments we were discussing last week, when we decide to go with the direct technique, I think we try to keep the cusp probably a little bit thinner. I personally do not anticipate any real complication by keeping the cusps a little bit thinner. What I have observed over hundreds, probably thousands of such restorations since I started doing composite in the mid-80s, so about 35 years from now.
Yes.
The only complication might be to see a little degradation of the margins, like discoloration, or it's not as clean as it could be on smaller cavities. But you can at any time, you can refresh the margins or do a slight coverage if ever needed. And what Engin was showing is that we also have, despite the fact the volume is a little bit bigger than what you might think is appropriate for a direct technique, you see that we have plenty of enamel on the margins, which is one of the important, also one of the important indications for direct restorations.
Yeah.
I think for me, more important than the buccolingual width, without speaking about the extremes, what is more important to me is that we get enamel in the gingival margins. I must here make a very clear statement. When you get a restoration, medium large, which cervical margins are below the CEG, you will never ever get the same adaptation quality as an indirect restoration. You will always get to some degree leakage. Whatever technology you use, whatever the adhesive system, whatever composite, you can even go with a bulk fitting material, it's not going to change. If you want to get a restoration that can last 20, 25 years with no problem, even in this indication, we must get enamel in the cervical margins.
Okay,
so here,
important. Can I translate a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Evet arkadaşlar, burası önemli tabii ki. Şimdi burada geniş bir restorasyon olduğunu, mühim olan minenin çok olması gerektiğini, burada endirekt mi direkt mi, tüberküllerin kapanıp kapanmaması, o bir ayrı bir şey konusu, ama burada mühim olan marjinlerde mine olduğu takdirde direkt restorasyon yapmanın hiçbir zararı yok. Ama oralarda mine bulunamaması halinde, sementte olmamız halinde ne tür bir restorasyon yapılırsa yapılsın, orada kısa dönemde veya uzun dönemde mutlaka bir takım sızıntılar olacaktır diyor. Okay.
So, in fact, I don't like to be dogmatic, generally speaking. I don't like to make statements which are very strong, but here I think we were unsure maybe 10 or 15 years ago in regard to which are the limits for direct versus indirect. I'm not saying that it is an absolute contraindication to use composite with a direct or to apply a direct technique with composite when you have one margin into or below the CG. But we must be aware that it is a compromise. It is a compromise. The quality will never be as good as what we can get with indirect. When you have large and deep, we shouldn't try to go direct. Ideally, we shouldn't try to go direct, or we need to tell the patient it's sort of a compromise. So you cannot provide the same guarantee, so to speak, in regard to longevity. So that's something I think important to mention.
Okay.
Next to that, or the next point, which is very critical in my view for the long-term success with any adhesive technique, but especially direct, is the adhesive system we work with. And I might do 3 dogmatic statements tonight. The second one is regarding the adhesive system. There is no modern adhesive system that is matching former generations in terms of quality and stability. Both bond strength and stability of the adhesive interface of modern adhesives is not as good as what you can get with classical adhesives. And I might just switch quickly to just a few images that I have prepared.
Just before go there, can
yes, sure.
A question? That with the cracks that I can see.
Okay, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit that your dentinal or enamel cracks? There is another one here on enamel. There is some here on dentin. What is your protocol to do that before going to the adhesive protocol?
Yeah. So cracks are basically found probably with a prevalence of 90 to 95, probably close to 100% around amalgams, especially the latest generation of amalgams. When we move from the classical composition to high copper amalgams, the extra copper into modern, so to speak, or the last generation, let's call them the last generation of amalgams, has tremendously increased the setting expansion. And cracks have become a very common finding around last generation amalgams. So what we see here on the picture is very common. I personally don't get any change, or I do not do any change in my protocol. I clean the cracks inside and outside, and I'm trying to seal the cracks in the best way I can. I will never try to open the cracks, because quite often those cracks are extending much deeper than the surface of the preparation, and you unnecessarily open the cracks and fragilize even further the tooth and remove tooth structure. The only cracks that we need to be really careful with is when the cracks are visibly open, and especially mesodistal cracks, those which run along the center of the teeth. That is a very peculiar situation. It's likely in this case that the patient might experience some hypersensitivity to cold or to pressure. Then that would be a reason to quit the idea of doing a direct technique and using composite. We should probably use something stiffer, like an overlay with lithium disilicate or something similar. But here, it's absolutely not the case. Those peripheral cracks, only the proximal surface, lateral cracks, small cracks, just within the enamel, are cracks to be simply sealed while we do the adhesion.
Okay. And we can talk about a little bit on ideas in that moment, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
so,
let me translate first for the
cracks. Sure.
Okay. Bu çatlakları sordum deminki gördüğünüz şeyde, hem Mine'de hem Dentin'de vardı. Ne yapıyorsun diyorum, bu çatlaklar bizim için epeyce önemli. Onun protokolünde eğer boydan boya mezodistal olarak boydan boya görünür, gözle görünür açık bir çatlak yoksa derinleştirmiyorum diyor. Temizliyorum ve birazdan konuşacağımız bonding sistemiyle kapatıyorum. Aksi takdirde böyle boydan boya bir çatlak varsa o zaman direkt restorasyon değil, belki chrome, belki overlay tarzı bir restorasyona gitmekte fayda var diyor. Şimdi immediate dentin sealing sordum, IDS, yani adhesive protokolü nasıl olur onu bakalım, dinleyelim. Yes, my dear.
So in fact, just to make a final conclusion on the cracks, it is important not to enlarge the cavity with no good reason. So small peripheral cracks are just to be cleaned like the rest of the cavity. Probably sandblasting is also nice to clean a little bit better those areas. And then we proceed with adhesion. When the cracks are really much deeper, we might have this problem of symptomatology, because cracks are always being infiltrated by biofilm. And if the crack especially is in the middle of the tooth, then there is a higher risk for symptoms. Still, it makes sense to clean them the best way we can with the sandblasting device. It's probably the best device we have. Infiltrate with a little more time. We give a little more time for the adhesive system to penetrate. Don't get too much light so that the adhesive doesn't set or doesn't polymerize too early, and leave time for the adhesive to penetrate and seal the crack. And don't forget, if you have access, seal the cracks from the outside. If it is in a proximal contact, you can place a matrix with the gel. You move the gel, the phosphoric gel, into the contact, and you can also bring some adhesive into the contact. You leave, of course, the metal strip in place so that you don't bond the two teeth together. And you try to seal the best way you can. It cannot maybe be perfect, but that would be already a great benefit for preventing the biofilm to penetrate inside the crack.
Okay.
Good. So you wanted to translate? No, not yet.
No, I
okay.
already.
Okay.
We can go to the IDS. Maybe.
Okay. So here I'll be very straightforward. My preferred adhesive system, or I have two systems that I really like. The first one, which you see here, which is the Opti1 FL, it's a 3-step etch and rinse system according to the Louvain classification. So we have a separate etching step. We have a separate priming step only for dentin, and we have a final bonding step with a true bonding agent. And this is a rather hydrophobic bonding. And having a hydrophobic layer is key to stability of your adhesive system. The second system that I like very much, I would apply it in a very similar way, is a 2-step self-etch, like for instance Clearfield SE Bond that probably everybody knows.
Yeah.
You have only one difference, is that you proceed only with selective etching of enamel. This is the image you see on the left. You start always by etching the enamel, and if you use a total etch, then you will etch also the dentin. If you use a self-etch, then you will go with the self-etching primer, and you will have also a third step with a hydrophobic bonding, or rather hydrophobic bonding. Whether you go self-etch direction or total etch direction, you will get the same benefit of having a hydrophobic layer. And this is what Engin was mentioning before. The IDS is actually creating a hydrophobic interface that protect the dentin, the underlying dentin, and which through the hydrophobic nature of the chemistry and the monomers, or the adhesive interface, will make it a lot more stable than hempiphilic adhesive system, like modern adhesive systems, where you mix the primer and the bonding. So you get something which is not so hydrophobic, and moisture can penetrate into this interface and potentially degrade the interface. And that we know will reduce the longevity or the quality of your adhesive interface down the road.
Okay. Let me try to translate this. It's whole lecture in adhesive lecture in here, but I can do my best. I think.
Sure you can.
Okay. Arkadaşlar kısaca bütün adezif sistemi anlattı yani 3 adımda. Esasında bunları biz daha önce tabii konuşmuştuk bizim şeylerde vakaları sunarken. Öncelikle şunu söyledi. Aslında modern adezivlerin tradisyonel adezivlere oranla bir üstünlükleri olmadığını söyledi. Orası önemli. Yani eskiden etching, primer ve bonding üç şişeli sistemlerin yani altın standart her zaman geçerli olduğunu o da söylüyor. Biz bunları hep konuştuk zaten. Ama 3 aşamalı yapılabileceğini, biri total etch, biri self etch, biri de selective etch olarak kısaca özetleyelim. Okay.
Good. And in fact, what I wanted to show you with one more slide is that if you use a universal adhesive, which is very common nowadays,
yeah,
what has been demonstrated is that you need to create the hydrophobic interface that you don't get with your adhesive. And what you see on the right side is actually placement of flow. On this case, I haven't used a universal adhesive, but it is recommended to use a flow to replace the bonding that you normally have with classical adhesives. So in fact, at the end, if you use a selective enamel etching, which is needed for any adhesive on the market, with no exception here, whatever adhesive, and I think Engin will be able to confirm, you need anyway to etch enamel selectively. Then you might go with the prime and bond step. You seam the layer because you need to evaporate the solvent. And at the end, you replace the bonding by the flow. So you transform what was sold as a one step, you transform it in a 3-step, and you don't even get the same result in terms of bond strength or stability. So at the end, somehow, it doesn't make much sense.
Okay.
I'm sorry we will not make very good friends with the dental industry tonight, but it is what it is.
Okay, okay. Yani mineyi gördüğümüzde etch ediyoruz. Ondan sonra yıkayıp universal adezifimizi kullanırken onu yine mineyi etch ederek kullanıyoruz. İçindeki solventi uçuruyoruz. Ondan sonra bir akışkan malzemeyle ilk tabakamızı yapıyoruz. Bu da zaten bir dentini hemen örtme, immediate dentin sealing oluyor aslında. Okay.
Good. So now we can move with the next slide.
Okay. That one.
Yeah. So now we have already started, but you will have some more views of the layering technique. But as you might imagine here, we are not using a bulk filling material. I'm not so, yeah.
That's why I want to ask you, especially that part, why you don't be familiar with these bulk fills, because we are using a lot of these materials.
Yeah, I'm not. Let's say, I will be less negative than what I mentioned in regard to adhesive system, modern adhesive systems like universal adhesives, which are they're not really bad. So maybe something that I would like to say, which it's not a situation, a binary situation, whether it's 100% bad and 100% good. We're absolutely not in this situation. But if you look for the very best, we probably go with classical adhesives, 2-step self-etch or 3-step etch and rinse. That's the golden standard still by today. Universal adhesives are sort of compromises, if I may say. They have a few additional properties which are not really needed for this application.
Sorry, what you think about the etching the borders of enamel and using universal adhesives?
Well, you still have the problem that your hybrid layer will not be created with a hydrophobic resin. And this interface will degrade faster than if you create your hybrid layer only with something rather or mainly hydrophobic. So this is why we call the interface which we create with any kind of prime and bond technology as a membrane. It behaves as a membrane, not as a barrier to moisture. And anything that allows moisture to penetrate will degrade. There is nothing, no chemistry that can allow a significant moisture to penetrate the material or the interface without degradation. And there is a lot of research showing that it is not as stable as classical adhesives with a hydrophobic layer.
That's why we need to use the primer in here.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. That's why we prefer to separate the steps.
Okay.
Because at the end, even if we use a universal system, we end up at the end with 3 steps, with a system that has not been really designed to be applied in that way. So it might be interesting, actually. Again, I don't want to be 100% negative. It might be interesting for pedodontics, for instance, where anyway we don't need long-term stability. We don't look for 20 or 25 years. We want to be able to work very quickly. It has some advantages in this regard. But if you don't need to save time or to gain time during your procedure, I would say I prefer to spend another minute and try to optimize the long-term results.
Okay, I had to translate that part because it's crucial, because everybody use these universals.
Well, it's not bad. Once again, it's not bad, but I think we can get a little plus with classical technologies.
Yeah. Şimdi arkadaşlar burası önemli. Hepsini tercüme etmek istemiyorum. Çok duruyor, şey oluyor. Onu da konsantrasyonunu boz. Eyvah. Kaçtı. Neyse gelir. Herhalde yanlışlıkla bastı. Ben o sırada şey yapayım. Evet, orayı önemli. Onları tercüme etmeye çalışayım. Bir dakika. Aynı zamanda Didier'i de oradan izlemeye çalışıyorum. Çok günümüzde var biliyorsunuz. Ben de dedim ki yani mine kenarlarını etch edip universal adhezimizi kullansak daha iyi olmaz mı? Tabii olur ama diyor yeterli o hibrit tabakayı oluşturmak için, iyi oluşturmak için çok yeterli olmuyor. Orada bir primer olmasında fayda var. Dolayısıyla universal bondingler bir saniye, evet şuradan alalım. Universal bondingler gayet rahat kullanılır ama biraz daha çabuk olmamız gereken durumlarda. İşte yaşlılarda, çocuklarda, şurada burada olabilir. Ama 1 dakika fark eder diyor. İçine yap, primerini sür, adezivini sür. Çok daha uzun dönemde daha iyi bir bağlanma, hibrit tabakayı daha iyi oluşturma şansı olur diyor. Bilgimiz olsun. Biraz daha işte klasik adezif sisteme tekrar belki geri dönmek demeyeyim ama hani göz ardı etmemek lazım. O altın standart devam etmek durumunda.
I'm personally not negative about this technology per se. I will only say that if you have a very large cavity, I would probably avoid using the flow version of bulk filling due to the fact that it has a very low E modulus. And I think this is something that colleagues should be aware of. The E modulus, or the stiffness as measured by the E modulus of Dentin, is 14 to 18. That's the E modulus of Dentin. Enamel is 80, and that is measured in gigapascals. That measures, in fact, the capacity of a substrate or tissue or restorative material to deform under a given load. The average E modulus of bulk filling flow materials is in a range of 5. So it means it is 5 times softer than dentin, which is not a problem per se if you have a small amount. We just completed actually a fatigue study, and we could see that the impact of this low E modulus is not negative in terms of adaptation until you place the samples on the load. But when you load them, then you get a very significant degradation of adaptation. Probably through a very simple mechanism, is that since the material is softer, on the load, the tooth deforms a little bit more, and with time, little by little, the interface adaptation is being damaged. The in vivo studies we have about those products are not so negative. They are, of course, not, like always with clinical studies, you have a lot of confounding factors. Most of those studies have small cohorts of samples. It's very difficult to compare to traditional materials. If we consider restorative bulk filling material, they have a little bit lower stiffness compared to classical composite systems. The shrinkage is anyway only half of a good restorative material nowadays is having a polymerization shrinkage which is around 2, maybe a little bit below in terms of volumetric shrinkage. If you take bulk filling material, they have a volumetric shrinkage of around 1%. It's less, yeah, around 1, but it's far from 0. So we must understand that when we go for really a large cavity, there is no way you can end up with a perfect result if you build up a whole cavity, especially a deep one, a large one, with one single increment. So we are trying now to evaluate. We started, because that has not been done apparently in the literature up to now, at least not with this protocol of fatigue studies, where we investigate the adaptation after fatigue, with bulk filled material being layered. Not 10 layers. Of course, we don't need to use as many layers as a traditional composite. But one way forward might be to not to try to fill up the whole volume of the cavity in one step, but maybe to do a few layers that might probably give a big plus to the adaptation. Yeah. If we compare, just to give you a rough idea, when we use a classical layering with a classical composite, you can go up to 75% of perfect adaptation into dentin for a medium-large cavity with a proper layering and a good adhesive system. With bulk filling materials, we never got above 60%. Usually after fatigue, we are more between 50 and 60%. It's not a huge difference, but to make a long story short, we can say that a classical composite with a good adhesive and classical layering, as we will see on the case, you get normally better adaptation than if you go with a single increment of a bulk filling material, even if we use the best ones.
What do you mean with the classical composite system? Like flowable or?
No. Then we use the classical technique that you will see on the case with a thin layer of flow, and then depending on the volume, either 2 horizontal layers or maybe with the 2 oblique layers for dentin and 1 for the enamel.
But we have to have a thin layer of flow, huh?
Well, it's helping. When you get a large cavity, the flow is playing a very peculiar biomechanical role of stress breaker function that has been proven to be very helpful to guarantee the best possible adaptation. But it is important, as we were speaking about the stiffness of the material, that we don't use a large amount of flow, because then we get in the exact same problem as what I mentioned before. If you get too much flow, it's not too much an issue with shrinkage, it's more an issue of too much deformation. So we found out that around 1 to 1.5 millimeter is the optimal thickness of the liner made with the flow that is improving the restoration quality. If you go much thinner, you don't get this effect. If you go thicker, you have finally a counterproductive effect of this layer that is deforming too much. And we need to understand that deformation is not good for the stability of the interface. We want somehow the restoration to behave as closely as possible as the tooth itself.
What do you think about if you use these bulk fill materials in a thin layer instead of low? Yeah.
Well, absolutely. What is important is to get a good compromise between the volume of the cavity, the volumetric shrinkage, and also the stiffness of the material. Because larger the cavity, more we need the restoration to stabilize the remaining tooth structure. So there is one role that we tend to neglect sometimes, is the stabilization, the mechanical stabilization provided by the restoration. The best material, in fact, the best material we could have that will never get detached during perennialization and movements would be silicone. If we would have an adhesive that bonds to the tooth, we could restore the teeth with silicone. We would always get a perfect interface. But we understand that if we have a large cavity and nothing inside to stabilize, we can imagine at a certain moment we'll break the tooth during the function. So it's a little bit an extreme example that I'm using here. But if we don't have a stiff material, if we fill up the whole cavity with a relatively soft material, you will not get the same stabilization effect.
Okay, what I'm trying to say is if the shrinkage percentage is lower than the normal flowables, these bulk fills, maybe we can use a thin layer of bulk fill and then go on.
Sure, absolutely. If you are in a critical environment, sometimes I use them also, the bulk flow. I'm not saying that I don't use them, but I use them in a very selective way, exactly as you mentioned. If once in a while I need to go relatively, I have maybe not a large cavity, but goes a little bit deep. When I'm in Dentin, I might more use a flow, a bulk fill flow rather than regular flow, because we know that it will, because it's not a configuration which is critical from a mechanical standpoint. It's more a configuration critical in terms of shrinkage of the material. If I have a very big cavity in a very critical configuration, then I might use a little bit of flow to do my liner, and then I go indirect on top.
Okay.
With, depending on the situation, either a composite or a ceramics.
Okay, let me make a small summary. Şimdi epeyce derinlere daldık. Ben geçen seferki yayındaki konuşmasından da bulk fillerle çok iyi anlaşmadığını anlayıp ve çok şaşırmıştım. Çok kullanıyoruz biliyorsunuz bulk filleri. Ama benim de tahmin ettiğim gibi hep o reklamlardaki ki efendim 5 milimetreye kadar, 10 milimetreye kadar, tek tabakada falan olmaz böyle şeyler diyordum ki işte o da söylüyor. Bunların sertlikleri yani i modülüs dedikleri o sağlamlık demeyeyim de esnemeleri, yumuşaklığı daha doğrusu biraz zayıf kalıyor normal Dentin'e göre. Bu Dentin replacement diyorlar ya, Dentin yerine geçen malzemeler diye yansıtılıyor. Halbuki Dentin 5'te 1'i kadar daha yumuşak kalıyor. Uzun dönemli şeylerde, güçlerde problem oluyor. Dolayısıyla ince kullanmak, birkaç tabakada kullanmak lazım diyor. Ben de diyorum ki akan kompozit gibi onu incecik bir tabaka tabana yaysak olmaz mı? Olur diyoruz. İşte böyle bir takım ödün vermelerle bu iş olacak gibi oluyor. Yani öyle kalın bulk film kullanmayalım. Okay.
So it is what's going to happen in the long run is a balance in between different factors. So sometimes we oversimplify the discussion when it comes to posterior restorations, that we might look at only one property. So volumetric shrinkage is one element, but of course there are some other elements. So we cannot basically disconnect the different factors because they all play in synergy. And when the tooth is under function, I'm always saying there are two things we need to think about when we do a composite restoration, a direct composite restoration, is what we get at the time we completed the treatment. So we hope to have a nice restoration, nice anatomy, good adhesion, but it's not the end. It's not the end. Then the restoration will be in function, will be on the load every day for years and years and years. And you want that the biomechanical balance, but it's not just a matter of adhesion and controlling the stresses at the time of placement, is how will this restoration and the tooth around work mechanically on the load. And that's why we cannot ignore some other properties. And this equation is not such a simple equation, because we have different parameters that we need to take into consideration. There is the fracture toughness, which is a dynamic property or a property of the material, which is measured in a dynamic way. There is the flexural strength, which is the intrinsic strength of the material. There is the E modulus. There are different properties that basically brought together give you a sort of understanding about what might happen. And then you need to test, because even taking into consideration 3 or 4 properties is usually not really enough to predict the behavior. There is anyway no property that can just be 100% predictive of the behavior, because there is a last parameter, which is you and I. How well do we handle the material? This is this finesse in the clinical protocol, and also a little bit of understanding about the properties of the material. Maybe I will open a presentation where I can show you a couple of long-term cases done with a similar technique that I will describe now, and then I will give you a perspective of what you can expect from such a restoration in 10, 15 or 20 years time.
Okay. Uzun vadeli restorasyonlar için izlememiz gereken yollar 5, 10, 15 hatta 20 yıl devamlılığını sürdürebilecek restorasyonlar için işte neler önerilir, nasıl teknikler bize söyler, onu konuşuyoruz. Okay.
Good. So while we talk, I will just open the presentation. So now what you see, you see here on the picture is the first step for the class 2 cavity. We close the proximal walls. We transform the class 2 into a class 1. Now, this is a technique that I started many, many years ago. And calling on Facebook, that's really very good. Different reasons, because it's really helping to control the anatomy and to make the whole process a lot easier. So I think now it is really something which is very very well established. So I don't think we need to discuss this a lot. Maybe the only detail that we might discuss a little bit later is the number of layers that we might use to close the proximal cavity. Maybe we can move to the next one.
Okay.
Where we might see a small detail of the you want to
a little bit, yeah. Şimdi ilk önce 4 numarayı restore ediyor. 2 yüzlü bir kavitede. Genel konsept her zaman biliyoruz tabii. 2 yüzeyli bir kaviteyi tek yüzeyli bir kaviteye çevirmek ana konsepte. Ama onu yaparken de hangi şeylere riayet etmek gerekir, onlardan bahsedeceğiz şimdi. Next one.
Yeah. I know we are already on the. Well, in fact, what I wanted to say, but you don't necessarily need an image to understand that, is that depending on the size of the proximal cavity, we have many different techniques that we might use. Either
I can go to the previous one if you like.
Yeah. In fact, you know what I'm going to do, Engin? I will maybe otherwise switch to very briefly to my computer and to show, okay, very briefly, so then you will have in parallel, you have basically, now I will just bring the computer a little bit closer. You have the flow, what we spoke about. So maybe even though the image quality is not as good as what you can see on Engin's computer, but you see, you might have a feeling about what is 1.5 millimeter. It's a thin layer of flow over the base of the cavity. And now you see the matrix, the sectional matrix. Let's just activate the laser pointer. You see here the matrix, the sectional matrix, the ring to stabilize the matrix and separate the teeth. This you know very well. And in fact, the very first layer that I did, because since the preparation is not very deep, I have filled the cavity from facial to lingual, but I leave a little space open here. I'm not closing the whole proximal cavity in one step. And the reason for that, and this is now the images which you see, the reason for that is to create as little stress as possible between those two walls. The proximal walls are being protected from marginal enamel fractures. And now you see from an occlusal perspective, you see here now the completion of that step. But this wall was built up in 2 steps vertical. I think it's relatively simple in term of concept. We do the build up in a way that we will control polymerization stresses.
Okay, now this is your second attempt of the...
Yes, exactly. This is the second layer actually. This is layer number 2.
Okay. Burada arkadaşlar bu duvarı yaparken 2 kere de yapıyorum diyor. Oradaki o fotoğraf bana yollayamadı onu. Şurada bir açıklık vardı. O açıklığı bırakıyor, polimerize ediyor. Sonra ikinci tarafı, küçük açıklığı ikinci kere de kapatıyor. Yani bu mine duvarlarını bir kere de birbirine, öyle bir konseptimiz vardı. Biz onu genelde okklusalde düşünürdük ama aproksimalde de 2 kere de yapmakta, o stresleri doğru düzgün ayarlamak için dengelerini 2 kere de yapmakta fayda var diyor. Okay.
Good. Yeah. And then the next step, since the cavity, this is the first premolar, the cavity is not extremely large, we'll go from now, as soon as we have closed the distal cavity, we'll go with only 2 more layers. 1 layer of dentin, which is pre-sculpted, and 1 layer of enamel.
Okay. What did you do in that enamel crack? There is some adhesive system.
Bonding, just bonding. We just basically leave the bonding to penetrate as well as it can into the crack. I don't think we penetrate. I don't remember to have seen a publication demonstrating the penetration depth of or adhesive into this kind of crack. But we can expect, we probably don't need the adhesive to penetrate all the way through the proximal wall, but at least to seal the outside as well as it is possible.
This is IMS, immediate enamel
crack sealing.
Crack sealing.
We invented something, immediate crack sealing, ECS.
ICS. Immediate crack sealing. Okay. Sadece orayı o çatlak mineyi bondingle geçtim, hiç gerek yok onu derinleştirmeye diyor. Ondan sonra bir tabaka dentin, ondan üzerine de bir tabaka mineyle bitirecek. Okay.
Good. So you see that even in a medium-sized cavity, the amount of time we're going to spend in layering is not that huge. It's just a couple of minutes. But next to the fact that we can even obtain the best quality with a classical layering up to what we have been able to study by until this date, We have also some extra benefit of using, let's say, a bilaminar approach with dentin and enamel. So we get something which looks even more natural. So now if we can move to, so now you see the dentin is being sculpted. We create the central groove and some lateral grooves into the dentin layer, but it's not very sophisticated.
Yeah.
Just to separate, to get also the space. We need space to restore with the enamel. Yeah.
Okay.
And now if we move to the next image, I think we'll have good perspective on the sculpting.
Okay. There is a saying, or there is a kind of concept, bulk and body. What do you think about that one?
Bulk and body?
Yeah, they are a concept like that. They are filling whole the cavity with bulk fill, and then only a body, a composite top on it, and then finished. That
you mean more for the flow, the bulk flow, right? Or a regular restorative bulk? Normally it's the bulk flow.
No, bulk flow,
yeah.
of course. There is lectures like that.
Yeah.
They fill up whole the cavity with bulk flow and then put some body on.
Yeah. From the research we have done on this technique, and we have done now already 3 different, or we are going now with the 4th research on the topic. It's not so bad, but it's not as good as a classical restoration.
We already talked about it too much.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So now I will maybe I can just show a few more images from the computer.
Okay.
We try always to create all the proximal walls first, and when this is completed, then we can move on with the other steps. So here you see that we have built it up. I like to build up the proximal walls, not 2 together, but 1 by 1. Maybe I lose another 2 minutes, but sometimes I can get, I think, a tighter contact if I do them one at a time.
Yeah.
But I'm completing the distal wall on the second premolar.
Yeah.
And now you can see also basically you have the same images now in parallel. We're gonna go with a single layer of dentin on the premolar, on the first premolar, on the second premolar. On the second premolar here, it's up to you. You can use either a single layer if it's well sculpted, or you can use also 1 facial increment of dentin, 1 lingual increment of dentin. It really depends on the depth of the cavity.
Okay.
And now you see with a different view, you see the sculpting of the enamel. This is a very important step, Engin, as you know, because by creating this groove, even if we don't use a bulk filling material, you separate the increment in multiple smaller increments. It means at the end, it's like building up the entire occlusal anatomy in multiple increments. And that's very effective to control basically pronization contraction. If you do the same with the sculpting, and the sculpting, you go with the sculpting until you touch the dentin usually, so that you can really separate the different occlusal parts of the different cusps. And you very, very rarely see any white line or any sign of pronization or non-controlled pronization forces.
Okay, let me translate.
Yeah, sure.
Şimdi burası çok güzel tabii ki. Bunu mineyi tek tabaka ile genelde koyuluyor. Ondan sonra da anatomiyi yapmaya çalışılıyor. Şimdi ya tek tüberkül yapmakta fayda var, veyahut böyle tek bir tabaka kullanıldığında burayı yaparken dentine kadar aletin ucunun geldiğini ve buraları hazırlarken bir ayırma yapılıyor. Yani Dolayısıyla stresler azalıyor ve şu bölgelerde hep bize sorduğunuz beyaz beyaz çizgiler oluşuyor. Yani polimerizasyon streslerinden oluşan tek tabakada kaplandığı için burada beyaz lekeler bu şekilde o zaman oluşmuyor. Şuraları dentine kadar, derine kadar oyup açıp öyle polimerize etmekte fayda var. Bu anatomiyi yaparken bilmiyorum anlatabildim mi? Okay.
Good. So it's really it's a very efficient way to minimize stresses when you build up a restoration with a normal composite material, and that was for the same reason, not only this one, but among other reasons also why we like to sculpt the dentin. We also need to create the space for the enamel, so it's both for anatomical reasons and also to control polymerization forces that we like to sculpt both layers, the dentin and the enamel.
Okay, maybe they will ask, while you sculpting like that, to touching to the dentin, then you create some grooves, some maybe little large groove. After polymerization, what do you do there? To fill up with some flow, or what do you think about it?
So now let me maybe, if you look now, well, I think you might have the same slides, Engin, right? Yeah. We have a last step, which is the characterization. Well, now on the upper image, yes, okay, perfect. What you see on the upper image is little colorants. This is the artistic touch. Some dentists might not like it, or some women patients, we need to be careful maybe not to exaggerate the occlusal characterization in young women patients. If they look in the mouth, they might eventually not like this painting if we have exaggerated. But this is playing different roles. First, to make the dentist happy, which is very important. Very, very important.
Yes.
It is sort of artistic. This is the only artistic touch that we have somehow in this technique. And because doing a posterior restoration is a lot about technology somehow. This part is a moment you can relax, because you go with your colors, you apply the colors into the fissures, and it's creating really very nice feelings. Again, we can be very discreet. I've used here a little bit of white, a little bit of brown. This patient is not a young patient. She's around 60 years of age. So all her natural teeth, those remaining, are heavily discolored on the occlusal grooves. So that's why here I allowed myself to do a little more. But it's really a lot of fun, doesn't take a lot of time. When you apply the colorants, you need to clean the excess, because you might always put a little too much. And while you clean the excess, you will use bonding. You need to use a brush or a micro brush with a little bit of bonding. And in fact, the bonding will slowly penetrate on top of the characterization material. And these very deep grooves which you have in the surface, they will be, in fact, they will not be optically closed, but they will be physically closed, so that you don't get discoloration there, you don't get food impaction, because that's something when we started to sculpt composite restorations in this way, it is true that we ended up sometimes with food impaction or staining of the grooves.
Yeah. Let me do it.
Yeah.
Şimdi arkadaşlar, burası enteresan. O mineyi derinden anatomiye göre derinden ayırdığımız zaman tüberkül arada tabii boşluklar, derinlikler oluyor. Orası derin kalır, oraya yemekler girecek, ne olacak diye sordum. Oraya bir şey mi akıtıyorsun, ne yapıyorsun? O da buraya geçti. Dedi ki bir renklendirme yapacaksak bu sadece artistik olarak, yani bizim kendimiz için yaptığımız şeyler o. Gerekiyorsa fissür renklendirme, ama bu aynı zamanda o biraz önce yarattığımız o aralıkların dolmasını da sağlıyor. Bu renkli olabilir, renksiz olabilir. Oraya bir bonding en azından akıtmak, oraya bir daha düzgün bir hale getirme için de faydalı. Okay.
Good. So it's really it's something that gives a little plus aesthetically, and if it is not the plus aesthetically, it's also a help to visualize the sculpting, because what I always found difficult up to the moment I've placed those surface colorants, I found it always difficult to see if my anatomy was correct or not. Okay. And having a correct anatomy not only is helping to get a better function, but also if the anatomy is correct, it means also the height you have been sculpting and you respect the normal anatomy of the tooth. That will reduce the time you need to adjust occlusion. Yeah. Better the anatomy, less time you're going to lose doing adjustments of occlusion. And also something that we should always remember, if we need to do some aggressive finishing because we have too much material, we build it up, the occlusal too high, the mechanical stress and the thermal stress on the margins, which are already a little bit under tension, because don't forget that or remember that during the polymerization shrinkage, everything is a little bit under tension. If you need to do a lot of finishing mechanically with your burrs, you will already damage the margins. So it is all benefit, not only because the restoration looks better, you will save time because you don't need to spend these, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes to adjust occlusion, and you will optimize the marginal adaptation of your restoration.
Very, very important part because
I think it is important. Absolutely,
we lose too much time to adjusting that occlusal contacts. It's waste of time.
Yeah,
I calculate once what I did in these 35 years, what amount of time I wasted with these occlusal adjustments. Maybe it's about some years to only do it these adjustments. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. So the better we are with our ability to sculpt, the better the results, the better the appearance of the restoration, the function, and for us, more effective we are. And in fact, the surface colorants, if you think, okay, it doesn't look good, do it only for the upper arch. But it's a very good learning tool for us to visualize the anatomy. Because when everything is white, somehow we are missing this information. As soon as you use a little bit of color, the anatomy is showing up and it reveals its quality or its defects. And then we can learn, because with us mistakes, with us observation, we don't progress.
1 minute.
Yeah. And while waiting for he's already here.
Do you see what it is?
Is it a big composite tooth?
No, it's soap. We are doing soap teeth every single weekend. In these weekends, we did whole arch. I'm doing and I put in Instagram. You can see it there.
Okay.
This is the upper molar. Just to remember the anatomy. That's for this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even if nowadays we have CAD/CAM systems, the CAM system can generate nice anatomies, but we cannot do everything with CAD/CAM. And normally also in between what you see on the screen and what you get from the machine, it's not the same. So the best CAD/CAM dentists nowadays, they always do some final touch with burrs and hands.
Okay, let me translate that one because it's very crucial. Arkadaşlar, yani bu akşamın tam da üstüne geldi. Benim bu sabunlar bak demek ki işe yarıyormuş. bana sormuşlardı, niçin bunu yapıyorsun diye. Ben de sizin için yapıyorum. Yani örnek olayım. En azından hatırlayalım diye. Şimdi o fissürleri yaparken, o fissürleri doğru düzgün yaparken ve de renklendirirken anatominin doğru olup olmadığını anlıyoruz diyor. O kadar önemli. Yani o fissürler, renklendirmeler doğru yerdeyse anatomi doğru. Anatomi doğruysa oklüzyon doğru. Oklüzyon doğruysa sizin oklüzyonu ayarlamak gereken zaman kısalıyor. Hayatınızdan yılları kazanabilirsiniz. Ben hesaplamak istemiştim böyle, bu oklüzyonu ayarlarken geçen zaman nedir diye, yıllar çıkıyor. Günde 15-20 dakika, yarım saat, bir saat bunu yaparsanız yıllar geçiyor. Bir de özellikle böyle blok blok doldurayım sonra alırım dediğinizde çok fazla miktarda kompozit konduğunda polimerizasyon streslerinden, büzülmelerinden dolayı sağa solu problem oluyor. İşte beyaz lekeler oluyor, şu oluyor, bu oluyor. Mümkün olduğu kadar gerektiği miktarda koymak lazım. Bunu yapabilmek için de anatomiyi bilmek lazım. Okay.
Good. Now, anatomy is key. Anatomy is key for function when it comes to posterior occlusion, and it is key to aesthetics when it comes to anterior restorations. So, and what I'm always saying for people who say, but you know, now with the CAD/CAM system and 3D imaging, I'm saying there is no system by today that will give you the perfect anatomy in every case. It's only when you see the restoration in the mouth of the patient that you might realize that it's blending in very nicely or it doesn't. If it doesn't, you need to be able to guide the technician and the machine about which change to do. If you just say it doesn't look good and you cannot interpret the reason why it doesn't look good, and you cannot then share this information with your partners in the lab, or if you, provided you do chairside CAD/CAM, if you are not able to correct what the computer has generated as a first project, you are stuck. You are stuck with your work. So anatomy, even in these modern times of CAD/CAM technology and 3D imaging, knowing anatomy is still a very important element to be a high-level dentist.
For sure. Anatomy is the key.
Yeah, absolutely. So you see that at the end, everything plays together. And I think we can move to the next slide. And okay, now you see the same tooth with not really only a vertical perspective, but sort of oblique perspective. So it gives you an impression about the anatomy. Those teeth are relatively flat, so they are not super. We haven't created a very deep anatomy. And if you look at this anatomy, and then the next slide, which I believe should be the final, you see that basically nothing has changed. If your anatomy is correct, you might need a very few corrections. Final touch, minor anatomical correction, and this is exactly what we said. That will help you to save a lot of time. And this technique we use also for tooth wear cases, and it plays the exact same role. If we can, even with a freehand technique, if you can build up the cusps and the worn areas of the tooth with composite, that is a very helpful tool to resolve in a very simple way tooth wear cases. And then I have a few cases to show for long-term follow-up with such technique that might help us to probably move to a conclusion.
Yeah.
You see here, well, I have left on the side, this is a catalog of material that Engin knows very well. I I made documentation for this catalog for the company, and the catalog and the product were launched in 2000. On the slide on the right-hand side, those are copies, but it was just to show that we have the documents, but the case was done 3 years before the copy. I just found out because I realized that it couldn't possible that the case was with the date 2001, while the catalog was basically launched in 2000. You see the technique? Those are medium-sized amalgams, relatively similar to what you have seen now with the step-by-step. You see the same concept, which was to build up the proximal wall with, I don't know, I will just take maybe to take
again with 2 increments, that proximal wall. Yeah.
So here 1 or 2 increments. This one probably 1, this one probably 2. Layer of dentin, I used some effect shade, white effect shade, because you see those teeth are very whitish. And there is a little bit of effect shade over a single layer of dentin. And now you see the case, while it's 16 years, in fact, we should add 3 years to these 16 years, because I found out that, in fact, the case was done in 1998.
16
so,
okay.
16, but now, in fact, on the picture, it is not 16, it is 19. We have nearly no marginal degradation. You see the margins here, but nothing bad. You see that anatomically, the restorations are nearly like the first day. There is no significant visible marginal degradation, no recurrent decay. And I'm not showing this. This case is nice because basically it's part of a documentation, so it can show that actually it's really this amount of time. And we have really, even since now 20 years, we have restorative materials which, applied in a proper way with a good adhesive and a good technique, can provide outstanding services for up to 20 years or even more. I think I should have another, okay, that is just to come back to this technique of sculpting. That is my first, I will just move it here. That is my first presentation for the department. That was in 1985.
1985'te kendi üniversitesindeki bölümündeki ilk sunumundan bahsediyor. Yes.
And I was willing to present this technique of characterization for the occlusal fissures. And because we didn't have those surface colorants in those days, 35 years ago, I was using pigments for ceramics, powder, and I was mixing it with modeling resin. Well, this is a tube which is a bottle a little bit more modern.
O zaman renklendirmeler yoktu. Porselen tozlarını kullanırdık. Kompozitin içine küçük renklendirmeler yapmak için teknisyenimizden rica ederdik. Porselen tozlarını bondingle karıştırıp renklendirme yapardık. O da o aynısını anlatıyor. Okay.
Well, as you can see, we couldn't mix so much color with the modeling resin because the modeling resin was not curing anymore, because it was the technology was, we did not have enough light curing initiator into the bonding. So when we were having too much color, then it was not polymerizing anymore. And we were using maybe a little bit too much of this color, but it's nice to see that this was 35 years ago that we were playing with those technique. And that was done in these very early days with the very first microhybrid.
Sorry, that was paste-to-paste composites?
No, it was the very first microhybrid light curing. Herculite, not the XRV, but the Herculite XR. You were having universal. It was the same color approach as the previous chemically curing composites, but this was one for the light curing. 35
years ago, there was an adaptic that afterwards these composites came to the market.
1985. The Kerr Herculite arrived on the market 1985.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Not to our country, I think.
It took 1 or 2 years more. You can imagine. And here you you see some of my first air-polite restorations made on a patient, and that is basically 32 years back. They are not big. They are not big. They are not big restorations, but
32 years after, it's still in work.
Yeah. Now they are probably 34 years, and this is now 32 years. And you see, there is no significant wear. Those materials, those microhybrids we had more than 30 years ago. At the end, if you look at the technology, it is not that much different from what we are using nowadays. We have improved some of the properties. Probably the most significant property we have been able to improve nowadays are aesthetic properties, color stability, and volumetric shrinkage. But in terms of mechanical strengths, those materials were as good as what we have today. We haven't done that.
30 senelik kompozitlere bakıyoruz arkadaşlar. 30 seneden fazla olmuş bunlar yapılalı. Okay.
So, why I'm showing this is that to say that even though I know that I'm going to lose, a little time doing my layering, I'm very much in trust with basic composite technology, because the different components which have been added to bulk filling technology, we know it's for about 5-6 years, but nobody can show now 30 years cases. What if something that we have modified into the technology, the basic technology of composite, might have medium long term an impact on the quality of the restorations? I'm waiting myself. For me, honestly, when something works so well, if I need to spend another 5, we made the calculation, how much time do we lose per restoration if we layer with a classical approach? 5 to 8 minutes, maximum 10 minutes on a large MOD, compared to a bulk filling. Sometimes you even need to maybe do 2 layers if it's not because of volumetric shrinkage, but just to technically control the anatomy. I personally prefer to lose those 5, 8, up to 10 minutes, but to guarantee that those restorations will be in the mouth in 20 years' time. Because this is why the patients come to me to get, they pay probably a little bit more. They don't pay 10 times the price, but they are in agreement to pay a little bit more for my work because they want this work to last. And we have seen so many technologies. You remember Engin packable composites. You remember Silorane. All those new technologies, they are gone. Almost there. They are nearly gone now. Classical nanohybrids, they are nearly gone now. There are so many generations, new generations of composite that were sold to us as true improvements. They are all gone. And I'm not sure if bulk filling materials will not just follow the same path, that in 7, 8 years, maybe 10 years, we'll realize that they have a couple of defective properties. They are not as good, and will come again with a new technology. When it works so well, I personally prefer to stick to what we know, what provides 20, 25 years, even up to 30 years. In the past, we would say only amalgam and gold can last 30 years. No, good composite systems, when they are done in a proper way, they can last 20, 25, 30 years. Not a huge MOD with both cervical margins deep into dentin. No, that is not the indication for direct. But small, medium, up to medium large, especially when we are above the CG, that works very, very well. And in this presentation, I don't know how much. Well, I have a lot more long-term cases, and it's not the conclusion, but just that because it's coming on the screen. There is a very interesting motto from John Wooden. John Wooden actually was the most famous coach in basketball, not a young one, in the US. And he was having a motto, which was, if you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it over? And I think that that's so much relevant to posterior composites. Take a little extra time and secure the longevity and the quality and the long-term behavior of your restoration.
Okay.
I'm not saying that we should close the door to bulk filling materials, but maybe not to use them in excess. Give us the time to learn a little bit more about their behavior. And especially when you go for smaller cavities, go with classical technology, because that works so well in small to medium-sized cavities. I will not take any risk to go with another technology today.
Okay, Didier, I don't know how much time we have. First, I want to thank you so much. And then these flowers all for you and for Manuela.
Thank you so much, Engin.
This
Thank
flower
you so much.
I found today in our lake. There is a small lake. I go with kayak and then take some pictures with these wonderful nymphaeas.
Beautiful, beautiful.
These are for you. And
thank you so much.
Let me translate that last part, if we can have time, and I will open the questions. And
Engin, I have a phone call with the US at 10. I need 5 minutes to get ready. Okay. So we have about, let's say, 10 minutes maximum on my end, but I think we can take a few questions if it's fine for you.
Okay, I will open the session, but I will translate first.
Yes, sure.
That last part, okay?
Yeah.
Arkadaşlar, şimdi kısaca anlatmaya çalışayım son söylediğini. 30 senelik kompozitler gösterdi. Bu kompozitleri tabakalamalarla yaptığını söylüyor. Bu sırada bu yıllar içinde bir sürü yeni teknikler çıktı. İşte tepilebilen kompozitler, seloranlar, şunlar bunlar. Onlar yok oldu. Bu bulk fillerin ne olacağı da tam belli değil diyor. Dolayısıyla klasik yöntemlerle tabakalamaya bir parça daha fazla zaman ayırarak çok daha uzun süreli, uzun dayanan kompozitler elde etmek mümkün. Dolayısıyla düşünmek lazım. Tamamen şeylere karşı değil, yeni tekniklere karşı değil, ama diyor benim gördüğüm, benim yaşadığım durum budur diyor.